Imagine standing at the highest tower of your father's palace, watching smoke rise from the city that once bowed to your family's name. The marble domes are burning, the banners are torn, and the only sound louder than the drums of war is the beating of your own heart. You are the emperor's daughter, and tonight you will witness the empire your ancestors built crumble before your eyes. History remembers emperors for their conquests and crowns, but rarely the daughters who watched their worlds fall apart. The Empire of Aurelian once ruled half the known world. Its palaces glittered with gold. Its armies marched with divine arrogance. For generations, it seemed unbreakable. But empires rot from within before they are ever conquered from without. Greed replaced wisdom. Betrayal replaced faith. And somewhere in those collapsing walls lived a young woman who saw everything. Her name was Selene, the last princess of a dying realm. She had grown up in luxury, surrounded by philosophers, poets, and generals who called her the moon of the empire. Yet beneath the beauty of her life lay the shadow of prophecy, a warning that when the moon turned red, the empire would fall. And one fateful night, as fire consumed the capital, that prophecy came true. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. The palace always smelled of cedar and burning oil, a scent that, to the young, Princess Selene had always meant safety. It was the fragrance of her childhood, the air of her empire, the smell of a world that she believed could never end. She had grown up in the great marble halls of Aurelion, a capital that gleamed like a crown set upon the world's brow. Her father, Emperor Cassian IV, ruled with the confidence of a man who believed the gods had personally chosen his bloodline to outlast eternity. But eternity, Selene would learn, has a cruel sense of humor. The year was 1327 of the imperial calendar, and the first cracks had already begun to show in the empire's flawless facade. Rumors of rebellion in the southern provinces, unpaid soldiers, famine whispered through villages that once overflowed with grain. Yet inside the palace, banquets still filled the nights with laughter and music. To the courtiers, decline was merely gossip. To Selene, it was a shadow that stretched a little longer each day. From her window in the eastern tower, she could see the city below. Endless rooftops of clay and bronze, winding streets where merchants once sang praises of the emperor's name. But lately, those songs had grown quieter. The people bowed less deeply. The guard's armor no longer gleamed. When Selene mentioned it to her tutor, a weary old scholar named Damaris, he sighed and said, "Empires die the same way stars do, my princess, slowly, beautifully, and then all at once." She didn't understand then, but she would soon. Her father dismissed such warnings, surrounding himself with flatterers who fed him illusions of control. Every night, he told his council that loyalty still held, that the gods favored his reign, that his daughter would inherit a world unbroken. Yet even as he spoke, smoke was already rising on the horizon, the first sign of cities burning. Selene's mother, Empress Livia, had once been a queen of a rival land. Her marriage, a treaty, forged in blood. She carried herself with the grace of a diplomat and the eyes of someone who had seen peace purchased too dearly. She taught Selene that silence could be a weapon sharper than a blade. A princess must learn to listen to the tremors beneath. The earth, she often said, because earthquakes announce themselves before they strike. When news came that the northern garrisons had rebelled, Livia said nothing at first. She simply walked to the window, her reflection merging with her daughter's, and whispered, "It begins." That night, Selene wandered through the corridors of the palace, corridors that seemed longer than she remembered, filled with whispers and the rustling of hurried footsteps. The grand mosaic of the empire's founding glimmered under torchlight, each tile a testament to conquest and glory. Yet as she stared at it, she couldn't shake the thought that those same tiles would one day be dust beneath someone else's feet. She was only 16, too young to command armies, too young to change fate, yet old enough to understand that her father's empire was a story nearing its final page. The days that followed blurred into an uneasy rhythm of councils, decrees, and half-truths. Messengers came and went at all hours, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion. The emperor, once surrounded by admirers, now ruled from behind locked doors, relying on increasingly brutal edicts to hold what was slipping away. The court became a theater of fear, nobles plotting in corners, generals avoiding each other's gaze. Selene watched it all unfold from the edge of rooms, her presence tolerated but rarely acknowledged. She began to notice details no one else did. The missing guards at the northern gate, the sudden shortages of bread, the way the servants whispered prayers to gods older than the empire itself. Then came the day the drums began. At first, distant, a rhythm echoing faintly across the hills. Rebellion had reached the capital. The city that had once been the heart of the world now beat with panic. From the highest balcony, Selene saw smoke curling up from the outer districts. The air vibrated with the clash of steel and the cries of the desperate. She remembered the prophecy spoken at her birth, that when the moon turned red, the empire would fall. And that night, as the full moon rose through the haze of fire, it did indeed shine crimson. Her father ordered the palace gates sealed. The imperial banners were lowered to half-mast. Inside the walls, silence took on the weight of grief. Selene's world narrowed to candlelit corridors and whispered orders. Her mother gathered what servants remained loyal, turning the inner palace into a fortress. The emperor raged at the gods, at his advisors, at his fate. But his rage changed nothing. Selene saw him not as the ruler of a continent, but as a man undone by his own arrogance. "Father," she said once, "perhaps it is time to speak to them, to understand what they want." He struck the armrest of his throne so hard, the gold cracked. "They want everything," he hissed, "and I will give them nothing." That was the moment Selene stopped being a daughter and became a witness. Days became nights without distinction. The palace trembled as enemy forces closed in. Courtiers fled under the guise of night, their loyalty vanishing as quickly as their courage. The imperial treasury was emptied to pay mercenaries, but even gold could not buy salvation. Selene helped her mother tend to the wounded in the lower halls, where marble floors ran slick with blood and candle wax. She learned the quiet horror of war, not from battlefields, but from the corridors of power. The sound of doors locking, the echo of prayers that went unanswered. Outside, the rebellion turned into a siege. The empire's enemies had united, smelling weakness. Banners that once bore the emperor's sigil now fluttered above enemy camps. Food grew scarce, hope scarcer still. On the 20th night, a fire broke out in the city below, spreading faster than rain could quench it. From the tower, Selene watched flames consume temples, markets, and homes. The people's screams rose like a chorus of the damned. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange calm settled over her. The empire had always promised eternal order. Now, its destruction felt almost merciful, a truth laid bare at last. As dawn broke, Selene found herself standing in the grand hall, surrounded by the remnants of what had been: statues toppled, marble cracked, banners torn. The emperor stood at the far end, his crown glinting faintly in the dying light. "Everything I built," he muttered, "burns because they could not understand my greatness." Selene stepped forward, her voice steady. "It burns because you forgot they were human." He turned to her, eyes hollow. For the first time, he saw not his daughter, but the mirror of his failure. She bowed, not out of obedience, but farewell. That night, as the enemy breached the outer walls, Selene climbed to the tower once more. The city was no longer a sea of lights, but a storm of smoke. She pressed her hand to the cold stone railing and whispered, "Let them remember, at least, that we were here." And as the palace trembled beneath her feet, she finally understood what it meant to watch an empire die, not in fire or ruin, but in silence. When the siege tightened, silence became the new language of the palace. Selene counted the passing days not by the sun, but by the rhythm of footsteps in the corridors, fewer each morning, softer each night. Servants slipped away, courtiers vanished, and even the fountains in the inner court ran dry. Her mother no longer wore jewels. She moved through the halls wrapped in a plain shawl, speaking only in whispers about the future that might still be saved. One evening, Livia pressed a small wooden box into her daughter's hands. Inside lay a miniature map of the empire, drawn on thin parchment by the old tutor Damaris. "If all else fails," the empress said, "remember the rivers. They always lead away from ruin." The words carved themselves into Selene's memory like scripture. Beyond the palace walls, the world was changing faster than anyone could speak of it. Letters arrived bearing unfamiliar seals. Allies became ghosts. The city's great library, Selene's refuge, was shuttered to protect what knowledge remained. She would sit by its locked doors, tracing the engravings of philosophers and kings who once believed wisdom alone could preserve a nation. Now their marble faces looked downward, ashamed. The wind carried a strange new sound across the city: hammers striking wood, builders raising barricades, citizens carving new symbols of power. The empire had not yet died, but it was being rewritten, letter by letter, by the hands of those who had once feared to speak. Inside the palace, the emperor grew smaller, his voice weaker, his robes heavier. The throne that once seemed to hold the world now appeared too large for him. Selene sometimes stood at the entrance to the audience hall, watching her father dictate proclamations that no one would enforce. He spoke of destiny, of divine justice, of the restoration that was surely near. Yet his words felt like echoes from another century. Selene wanted to believe him, to preserve the fragment of faith that had shaped her childhood, but even faith needs an anchor, and theirs had long since sunk. She began to write secretly in her journal, not of rebellion or politics, but of faces: the guards who still smiled despite hunger, the maids who hummed lullabies while sweeping dust. Those small acts of grace became her empire now. One gray morning, the palace bells rang not for war, but for departure. The council had convinced the emperor to leave the capital, to seek refuge in the mountains where loyalists still held ground. Selene packed a single chest under her mother's quiet instruction: one gown, a silver comb, the family seal, and a book of poems. Before dawn, a handful of carriages waited in the courtyard, their wheels sinking into the wet stones. As she stepped inside, Celine turned for one last look at the palace. It seemed alive even in ruin, the columns breathing, the domes reflecting the first faint light of day. She whispered a promise to remember every detail, so that no future historian could erase what had been. The journey that followed was a long elegy. Villages once bound by loyalty now watched them pass with indifference. Children stared, but did not bow. In the hills, banners of different colors fluttered, proclaiming new rulers, new creeds. Each mile carried away another layer of who she had been. The Princess of Aurelion became merely a traveler in a world that no longer spoke her name. At night, when the fires burned low, she thought of her tutor's words. Empires die like stars. She began to see it clearly now. The same beauty in their ending that once marked their birth. Weeks later, they reached the mountain fortress. Its cold stones and thin air felt more like a memory than a refuge. Messengers came bearing grim tidings. Cities surrendered, allies defected, provinces renamed. Celine watched her father unravel beneath the weight of each report until he became a shadow sitting by a window, staring toward a capital he would never see again. Yet, in that isolation, something within her awakened. She began to record everything. She remembered the festivals, the markets, the laughter of the riverboats, determined that if the empire could not live, its story would. She wrote until her fingers trembled, until the ink froze in the winter air, until her memories became her rebellion. When spring finally arrived, the mountains bloomed with wild flowers, and Celine realized that the world itself had not ended. Only the world she had known. She walked to the edge of the cliffs one morning and looked down at the valleys below, where new banners rippled and smoke from fresh villages rose like prayers. For the first time, she felt no anger, only an ache of understanding. Nothing is eternal, she thought, except the stories we choose to keep alive. Years passed in quiet exile. Seasons turned the mountain fortress from stone gray to snow white, and back again. And Celine grew from a sheltered daughter into a woman who understood the mathematics of loss. She no longer wore silk. She wrapped herself in wool and routine, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, reading the stars through the narrow windows of her new home. Yet every evening, when the last light faded, she opened the box her mother had given her and traced the tiny rivers on the map of Aurelion. She could almost hear them again. The murmuring crowds, the ringing bells, the steady pulse of a world that once believed itself unbreakable. Her father's health waned quickly after their flight. He spoke less of divine right and more of forgiveness, asking in fragile moments whether the gods punished pride or merely observed it. Celine never answered. She had learned that silence carried more mercy than certainty. When the emperor finally passed, no trumpets sounded. A handful of loyal attendants buried him in a small chapel above the valley, beneath a stone carved only with his name. Livia placed a single coin upon the grave, a final gesture to an old belief that souls must pay for passage to peace. And then she turned to her daughter and said, "Now, the empire belongs to memory." The words struck Celine not as defeat, but as inheritance. The empire's treasures were gone, but its meaning still lived in those who remembered. She began gathering what fragments she could. Bits of parchment, letters rescued from ash, melodies of half-forgotten songs. With patient devotion, she rewove them into a record. a quiet chronicle of how beauty and arrogance, faith and folly had intertwined to build and break a civilization. In that act, she discovered that remembrance, not rule, was the truest form of power. One autumn morning, a traveler arrived from the new capital below. He brought news that the world was changing once again. New rulers drafting new laws, new scholars rewriting the past. He asked if the Lady of the Mountains, as people now called her, wished to return and offer counsel to the rebuilding court. Celine listened without reply. That night she walked to the edge of the cliffs, where the air shimmered with moonlight, the same moon that had once glowed red over her father's burning city. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant smoke, but not of destruction, only of life continuing elsewhere. She realized then that she no longer needed to be seen to bear witness. The Empire's lesson was written in her heartbeat. Everything created by hands will fall, but everything carried by words endures. She left the traveler a single manuscript bound in faded cloth and asked him to take it to the libraries of the New World. "Tell them," she said, "that the daughter of the last emperor remembered. When he departed at dawn, she watched until the path disappeared among the trees, then turned back toward her quiet home. The sun rose over the ridges, gilding the snow in light, and for the first time in years she smiled. Not for what had been lost, but for what she had saved. History rarely remembers those who watched instead of ruled, yet sometimes the truest strength lies not in command, but in endurance. The story of Selene, the emperor's daughter who witnessed the fall of her world, is a reminder that even when power crumbles, meaning can survive. Her empire's collapse was not just a tale of war and pride, it was the closing of an age and the quiet beginning of memory itself. Through her writings and her silence, she carried forward the truth that nothing built by conquest lasts forever, but everything carried by compassion endures beyond generations. Every empire falls, but the eyes that witnessed it, the hearts that learned from it, and the voices that retell it, those never fade. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Your support keeps these forgotten histories alive and helps us bring the echoes of the past into the present. One story, one lesson, one lost voice at a time.